This is the John Batchelor Show. Situation in Kiev remains unstable. There's an appointed prime minister, the deputy of the Fatherland Party, in place in these last hours. You know, Kiev is 7 hours ahead, so it's the middle of the night. Later on, I'll have a report on Kiev. I observe, having talked to Kiev within these last hours, that the security in the city is unknown. The police have disappeared. There are volunteer gangs, groups, volunteers, men in unusual garb, helmets, wearing an odd collection of armor on their chests and backs as if that will protect them from violence. They are providing security in the government buildings. They ask people to get off the grass. There's a lot of good spirit. I talked to Stephen Erlanger of the New York Times this afternoon in Kiev. The cell phone, the mobile phone reception is very poor, so I will not be able to play that report. I'm just repeating what Stephen told me. He visited recently one of the buildings where Yanukovych poured his wealth. Apparently he had unusual taste. Stephen used a word pointing towards poor taste. But in any event, the situation in Kiev is anything but positive. They're without money, and the IMF wants to help, but they need a government to trust, to give to pour money in to Kiev. They owe up to $35 billion in obligations to European banks over the next months. John Kerry this afternoon, the Secretary of State, offered $1 billion. Now we turn to Asia, East Asia, where there is stability, there is wealth, but there's a new problem. I say it best by saying, Gordon Chang, a very good evening to you. Short, sharp war. That quote has been dominating the news this last week. It's by as an officer in the U.S. Navy using that term, short, sharp war. What's he talking about, Gordon?
Good evening, John. Captain Flannel, who is the head of intelligence for the Pacific Command, has been saying that China has been preparing for such a war with Japan.
Short, sharp war. We welcome Scott Harold, Associate Political Scientist at the RAND Corporation, based in Asia. Scott, a very good evening to you. The video of Captain Flannel and the quotes, Google immediately translates it for anybody who wants to read this. It's very pointed. Apparently, over the last year, there has been a recognition in the United States Navy that China's policies in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, its aggression is coming up against resistance. China and Japan, short, sharp war. Do you think that's credible in the immediate future? Good evening, Scott. We'll get him back. We've lost him when he was calling in. Gordon, I'll turn to you on this. Short, sharp war. How would that work? How would that work for the United States and for Asia? Would that be something that could be contained?
Well, China believes, apparently, that they can sort of take over these islands that Japan now administers and which Beijing claims. And so they think that they can get it done with quickly before the United States could get involved, and therefore they could present us with a fait accompli. Now, a lot of countries in the history have thought that they could win short, sharp wars of various sorts, including the Germans in World War I, and somehow it just doesn't work.
Scott, we've got Scott back on the line. Good evening, Scott. Yes, 100 years ago, Gordon's quite correct. All the armies were home by Christmas and nothing really bad happened to Europe. So a short, sharp war, is that credible in Asia? Do people entertain the possibility that it would be just a long, bad weekend? Good evening to you, Scott.
Good evening, John, and my apologies for the slight mix-up with the phone there. I don't think that there is any prospect that a conflict between China and Japan would be over quickly, although I think there certainly could be those within the Chinese military who would aspire to that capability. And I think that Mr. Flannel is worrying about that possibility by looking at how the PLA trains and what capabilities they might be trying to build. But obviously the last time that these two countries engaged each other militarily, it was anything but short, but it was certainly very, very sharp. And I think that should focus the minds of everyone who's looking at this issue.
Scott, it's very interesting. There's a big discussion about whether Flannel's assessment of China is correct. But I think what's even more fascinating is that American flag officers, when asked about Flannel's assessment, have really sort of ducked the issue, or they said that essentially that things are okay with China. What's going on here?
Well, I think what's happening here, of course I'm speculating, but, Fannel is an intelligence officer who is assigned to look at what Chinese operating capabilities are and how they're training. American flag officers, on the other hand, are tasked with managing the relationship as a whole, and of course their response has come while General Odierno, the Chief of Staff of the Army, has actually been visiting China, and there is a big priority on trying to improve U.S.-China military-to-military relations. So it would be fair to say that they are looking at a bigger, broader set of issues. They may not be familiar exactly with the intelligence that Mr. Fannel is analyzing and looking at. He is the Director of Intelligence for U.S. Pacific Fleet, so he's looking at a very specific set of issues. They are trying to look at a much broader set of issues, and it would be fair to say that they are a little bit more political or being more diplomatic, whereas he's talking about some operational issues at a little bit more higher level of granularity.
Scott, we're leaning heavily on the China side. Tokyo has a vote. Has it commented on this unusual remark by an officer in the United States Navy?
It's an interesting question, John. I haven't actually seen any remarks yet out of Tokyo.
Neither have I.
I was in Tokyo last week, very late in the week, and I didn't hear anything about Captain Fannel's remarks at that time.
Why I ask, of course, is that Japan has a self-defense force. I've been told, though the officers are older, actually the whole Japanese economy is based on older workers. I've been told that it will do very well in any conflict, any gunboat exchange with China. Is that your information? Or is China right now in a position to overwhelm Japan with quantity?
Well, actually, John, I think both of those are worth picking up on. Yes, the Japanese Naval Self-Defense Force, Maritime Self-Defense Forces, the JMSDF, is a highly professional force. They operate very sophisticated platforms. But on the other hand, the Chinese are looking now and certainly in the future to swamp quality with quantity, and also to continue to climb the quality ladder. So in that sense, I think you'd say at present there are reasons to think that Japanese defense capabilities are very prominent and should focus Chinese minds. On the other hand, over the long haul, I think the Chinese goal is to be able to say, even if you marginally edge us on quality, we're going to operate increasingly large numbers of vessels, and we're going to gain on you in the quality domain such that eventually size will swamp quality.
The joke in Japan, Scott, has always been that it's been safer to be in the self-defense forces than it is to be in the Tokyo police force. And this could very well change in the very near future. But I think you're absolutely right that Japan does operate some very sophisticated platforms. And essentially, if there were a fight, it probably would be closer to Japanese bases than it would be to Chinese bases. And so therefore, you have this whole logistical issue. When you look at this, for instance, let's say a conflict today, how do you think it comes out?
Well, as you said, Gordon, this would certainly be closer to Japan if it's in the Senkakus. Then again, it's not going to be just a China-Japan conflict. The United States has clarified repeatedly under Secretary Clinton, under Secretary Kerry, that the United States is treaty-bound to defend Japan if Japanese forces are attacked, and that's without prejudice to any claims to the Senkakus by either side. It's simply a matter of the U.S. treaty alliance that obliges us if Japanese forces come under attack. So this would not be, if there was a short or sharp war, or a war that was long and sharp, not be a war between just China and Japan. The United States would come in, and when you add together U.S. and Japanese military capabilities, it very quickly becomes a very long, or else very, very sharp and risky confrontation. And it's one that I think will continue to focus Chinese minds away from the prospect of of launching a very risky war, because it would be a war that they could not control the outcome of, and that could cost them very substantially. Much more so than I think the people would think about. In fact, if you look at the Taiwan scenario, that's probably one of the reasons that deterrence has held for so long.
Scott, a simple question here at the end. Does it go nuke?
Gordon, I'm sorry, John, I think that's certainly one of the risks, and it's one that I think people are aware of. And for that reason, some rocks in the East China Sea, as some people have referred to them, that's not something that China or the Chinese Communist Party wants to put its entire leadership stake that bet on.
I understand, but isn't it true that all war games eventually go nuke, Scott? I've heard that for years.
It's certainly the case that you have to think about the escalation ladder all the way to the top rung, and that would certainly be the top rung. And that's not a place where any of us should really be ignorant of the possibility of it going there. So definitely that's something to worry about.
Scott Harold, Associate Political Scientist at the RAND Corporation, Gordon Chang of Forbes.com. I'm John Batchelor.